In my last video, I talked about Deltarune's weird route and narrative traps, such as the Pacifist route, but a lot of you noted I left out some key details, like Chapter 0 and how we may get there. What may cause a save bleed? Will it be just like Undertale? The crossroads between Snowgrave and the weird route, and other subtle details that I might have missed along the way. So this time I want to take a step back, clean up those points, and look at the bigger picture, such as the depths and how it functions, time travel as a game mechanic, the prophecy being bendable, how the story of Deltarune is a meta hero's journey about the player, and how Chapter 3's egg is likely another meta narrative trap. It's my hope that by the end of this video you'll be inspired with your own ideas of what may or may not be happening. I think we should all keep an open mind and not lock ourselves into just one road of possibility, until the story is fully unveiled. But, again, I apologize if I missed anything or overlooked anything, and I hope this is not too much detail to go into. I'll try to keep this as short, as sweet as I can, while driving into at least a base level of detail. Hopefully this doesn't sound too roughly edited, but this video is likely going to be 3 hours long of me rambling, and I'm going to try to edit it to make it as bearable as possible, so please forgive me. Now, let's talk about the crossroads between Snowgrave and the Weird Route. Functionally, these two routes are the same within the crossroads. It is the lead up and aftermath that is the important bits that make the difference. So, to give a brief summary of what my theorized weird route would look like, it would start with a pacifist run up to the weird route itself, then it would immediately go back to pacifist. Whereas in the Snowgrave route, it would follow more directly to the sword route shown in the Chapter 3 minigame. And that is why I do not believe that we can do a Snowgrave route until Chapter 0, which I will be talking about in greater detail later in the video. The other possibility is that the weird route itself is not fully possible to run until Chapter 0 as well. Again, more on that later. There's also been a lot of talk about the possibility that the true weird route could also be the aborted weird route, where you keep the ring, but you stop. This also brings up the fact that Chris keeps the ring. This is rather outside of the scope of this video, but is still an interesting concept to think of regardless. Perhaps this ties into the eggs, which I will also be talking later about in the video as well. Alright, in the last video we talked a lot about meta-narrative traps, but we didn't really get into the meta-narrative itself. The meta-narrative means that Toby isn't just telling a story about Chris, Ralsei, and Susie, he's telling a story about us. Undertale gave us a glimpse of this with Flowey mocking us for saving and loading. Deltarune doubles down on that. The real character that Toby has built their story around is the player themselves. Now, what does that mean? In most games and RPGs, you pick a character, you pick a class, and you immerse yourself in that character. But because of the meta nature of Deltarune and Undertale, I'm led to believe that the character that Toby is most interested in changing and having go through a quote-unquote journey is the player themselves, meaning that the player themselves goes through trials and tribulations. Most games in general use the hero's journey, but here's the twist. In Deltarune, again, the hero isn't Chris, it's us the player. We're the ones who want a happy ending. We're the ones making choices, wrestling with guilt, and we're the ones who fall for all of Toby's meta-narrative traps. Now, I'm not saying that the only story being told is the player's story. Chris has their own journey, Susie has their own journey. Susie holds the white pin of hope that puts away the darkness, but again, when dealing with a meta-narrative story like this, that isn't the only thing that's happening. We're dealing with layers. The first layer is reality itself. Right below that reality would likely be the depths. Right below that layer of reality would likely be the light world. Then below that, the dark world. And then below that further would be like playing the game that we see in Chapter 3. And you could also argue that it would be here where the depths would be. While still speculative, I believe that the depths could represent both the higher levels and the lower levels below. So, for example, I have Deltarune installed on my computer, but I also have Undertale installed on my computer. These two programs don't really quote-unquote connect, but they lay in parallel to each other on the hard drive or on the internet. And it's interesting that Toby does in fact wear the mantle of Gaster to communicate with us via the internet. And it's exactly this level of meta that I really want to get into and discuss its implications. The player is simply thrown into the world and told that their choices don't matter and the future seems to be set in stone. Yet almost every action that the player takes has meaning, and the desire of the player will be made known by their own actions. The eggs show their desire to know everything, the shadow crystals their desire to defeat every challenge. The simple dialogue choices along the way build a story about the player. Did they just want to see what happens? They will meet that desire to know what will happen. Did they want to take control no matter what to gain agency? Then they will meet with their desire for agency. But at what cost? Did they seek a better ending? Perhaps that is the desire most sought after in the end. Most everyone would want a better ending after all. So, in the end, the angel banished will finally meet with its desire. Again, the prophecy at no point broke, it was bent. And with that said, let's go ahead and move on to the prophecy itself, and how I think it is bendable. Whether or not it can be broken is up for speculation, and probably would not result in the best ending, but that's neither here nor there. For now, let's just assume that the prophecy is only bendable. Let's look at the Queen's car, and how it cannot be stopped. Yet, it stops just fine when the Queen wants it to. And in the weird route, we don't even see it, so it's neither here nor there. It's not been broken, but bent, or sidestepped. Love finds the girl is also a possible bending of prophecy. Does love mean level of violence, as in Undertale? Maybe. Does love mean us, the player, entering the girl? In a lot of the prophecy imagery, we see a heart literally within the girl. What about the normal and pacifist route? Is it possible we somehow end up in Susie? I'm not really sold on that idea, but it's possible, I suppose. Then again, we could just be overanalyzing this, and love could simply mean that Noelle's and Susie's crush. And the most striking and obvious one being that Noelle is clearly being used as a vessel in the weird route. And this is really just the tip of the iceberg. You could look at any one of the prophecies listed and come up with any number of interpretations to it. For now, I'm going to try to keep it short and sweet as I can. I don't want this to be a 10-hour video. So let's jump on to Chapter 0. Last video I only roughly went over the idea of what a Chapter 0 would be, and I didn't go into great detail about how we might get there, or the ramifications of being sent to Chapter 0. It's possible that all roads lead to Chapter 0, and I'll get more into that during the Hero's Journey segment of this video. So, depending on actions taken during the first section of the game, you would likely get an alternate dialogue. Did they just want to see what happens? Did they take control no matter what to gain agency? Did they seek a better ending? All leading up to a very Flowey-like conversation of, what if I told you I knew some way to get you a better ending? Then sending the player back to Chapter 0. Now, I think that we will likely start off outside of Hometown, much like the area detailed in the Mantle game in Chapter 3. Perhaps in our proper Vessel Goner. And we will likely have the freedom to do what we want at that point. Now, we know there's a lot of correlation between what happens in the game and the lore itself within the game. In Lord of the Hammer, the City of Shining, the Isles of Northern Light, the Field of Pink and Gold, both Dragon Blazers and Dragon Blazers 3 contain an ice palace, much like the Sword Route area in Chapter 3, again, the Mantle game. I want to theorize that these locations will likely be areas outside of Hometown. Again, we have two routes of exits that could be theoretically accessible that being the closed-off road and the lake access. Considering the order of operations in which the mantle game happens, we see the first two stages with a lot of water access. It's highly likely that the water stage access points is quite literally what we will end up in a Chapter 0 scenario. Now again, this is pretty high speculation here. It could just be as likely that it's Chapter 6 and 7, or even 5 that this happens in. And because of the bendable nature of the prophecy itself, this could very well just as easily happen in a dark world with no further exploration of the main light world itself. Again, I will explain in greater detail how this may incorporate itself into the hero's journey, and how Save Bleed may in fact play deeper into this in Chapter 0, which we will dip into later in the video. And I guess this is as good as time as any. As to why we would go back in time to Chapter 0 and the like, we should really start talking about saves and time travel itself. Now, the act of saving in Deltarune is a form of time travel, and it's very much a real and tangible thing inside of the game itself, much like in Undertale. Now, unlike in Undertale, there's not a great number of characters that react to your actions throughout the saves, except for one. Gaster is fully aware of your movements in the save areas. When you're defeated and when you come very close to victory over a fight you were not meant to win, making comments saying, "Very interesting, your loss here is all but guaranteed," and yet you persist, and that if you are so determined to try once more, then shall we hasten? And instead of us just going directly back to our last save location, we just jumped straight at the start of the fight again. Possibly meaning that Gaster themselves is actually directly enabling our time travel shenanigans. Possibly also showing that our direct control over time travel isn't quite in our control. After all, it was Gaster that invited us into this game. Or survey program. Now, this is where I'm going to bring up parallel universes, time travel, and the depths itself, and how they all interlink. The theory I have is that the depths is where all of these linkings happen. So the depths itself acts as the universe, as it were. Space and time are relative. In other words, from our perspective, being outside of this universe, let's say that the universe is represented as a hard drive on your computer. When you load a file, you're simply clicking a button and loading it. Like if you were playing any other game, you would simply just be taken to that quote-unquote state of the game, and the save progress would be loaded in. Whereas to the characters within that game, they wouldn't notice anything had happened, but perhaps you've created a alternate doomed universe, for example. Not to say that that is what's happening, but it could, in theory, be one of the possibilities. Again, when Toby puts on the mantle of Gaster and literally posts on the internet as Gaster, and thus the shattering across time and space becomes more apparent to the meaning. So we have Toby literally putting on the mantle of Gaster, showing that one of the pieces, as it were, literally escaped into real life, quote unquote. Now what does that mean? It means that on a surface level, Gaster has the same ability to save and load as if it was a game as well. So I want to think that the internet itself could represent the depths, for example. When Gaster is broken across time and space, he invites us into the survey program, Deltarune. Maybe the true meeting point of Undertale and Deltarune isn't the timeline, but the depths. It isn't a parallel universe, but the depths itself that connect them together. In other words, they are parallel, but within your hard drive or the internet. Speculation. Again, when we make our character, it's in the depths. So the depths could represent the internet and the computer or console that the player is using. Perhaps that's just one layer of the depths itself, and the depths is also layered. Again, speculation. I can go into a deeper dive on this idea at a later time if people are interested. But for now, let's move on to Save Bleed. Save Bleed will likely be the core theme of Deltarune, much like in Undertale, but the question becomes when, where, and by what degree does it affect the story. I think that Save Bleed will only happen once we enter Chapter 0. There will be a few paths that this could take, and none are really set in stone. I think that Save Bleed will happen based on eggs, possibly, and again, more on that later. Save Bleed will probably happen based on attempted violence. This will be checked probably by the level of recruit numbers for set encounters not skippable. Save Bleed might also possibly happen based on what Chris may do at the end of the Pacifist route if Chris gains some kind of power, control, or uses the player in such a way beyond the player's realization. Again, moving into a Chapter 0-like scenario. There is a possibility that Chapter 0 won't come into play and that the Weird Route, or Snowgrave Route as I like to call it, will lead to a direct game-altering event, much like what happened in Undertale. I truly believe that Save Bleed won't really be a thing until Chapter 0. Once Chapter 0 is in effect, Save Bleed will become much more apparent. In other words, because of our level of freedom within Chapter 0, we will be judged more harshly based on our actions. Again, because the game is not fully released, this is extremely speculative. But if Save Bleed did happen, this would just be the tip of the iceberg, and the possibilities would be wildly unknowable. It could just be a simple message and an altering of the ending, like we saw in Undertale, and it could just be completely game-altering, such as like a New Game Plus scenario or anything else. Again, speculation is just absolutely wild now. Alright, let's try to re-ground ourselves. Let's talk about the hero's journey I theorize the player is actually going through. A very meta hero's journey. In the ordinary world, you've already played Undertale. You know the game, you know the stories, you expect a pacifist or genocide, very binary moral tale. You think you understand the rules of Toby's storytelling. In the call to adventure, out of nowhere, you're invited to the survey program. But here's the twist. It's not Toby inviting you. It's Gaster, broken across time and space, borrowing Toby's identity to lure you in. You're told you have no control, yet you are still asked to make choices, a contradiction that immediately destabilizes you. Now, in most heroes' journeys, the mentor shows the hero the way forward, but in Deltarune, the mentors are fragmented, they're incomplete. Rousey says kindness is the answer, but learns it isn't always enough. Susie says force is the answer, but learns that isn't quite right either. And then there's Gerson, whose wisdom cuts deeper than any of them. He says the prophecy's words are too bright, and that truth is found between the lines, in the darkness where things become less clear. If you follow the prophecy word for word or treat morality like a checklist, you lose sight of where you're really going. If you follow a guide or follow a dogma, pacifism or violence or prophecy, you're not making choices, you're obeying a script. And so the true mentor message isn't about being kind or being strong. It's about resisting the temptation to let someone else's rules dictate the meaning of your journey. Then there's crossing the threshold. The game by default crosses this for the player literally when they open the game. This also happens on a meta level when going to a dark world, and again when making the first save over Chris. This happens on a third level when playing the mantle game or the sword route. And the weird route is the strongest connection to crossing the threshold of the narrative itself in a bid for control, the varying degrees of which we talked about before. And on to trials and failures. This could be as simple as the gameplay itself. It could be the moral choices we made along the way as well. Did you fight the Roaring Knight over and over again? Did you just want to see what happens whenever you do something bad? Did you perhaps look up a guide and figure out where to get all the eggs? This is likely why there are 3 save slots as well. On to growth of new skills. As the player fails and reloads, they get better at the game. Every failure results in the player getting better and growing their skills as they play. In the weird route, we have done more than just grow, though. We've planted the seed of escape from Chris and gaining a new vessel, quite literally. In Death and Rebirth, the player will not die, but rather be faced with a great challenge and dragged into possible hell. Maybe even follow the tale of hell. The player also could possibly be reborn into a new vessel, possibly Noelle in the weird route. Or perhaps it's as simple as Chris's hand. Or perhaps it's even Susie. Speculation, again, runs wild. This could be an iceberg. You could also argue that Death and Rebirth is just every time we load a save. But usually Death and Rebirth means dragging through hell, a traumatic event. The traumatic event usually leads to a revelation. The revelation could be where Chapter 0 starts. This could be the revelation that the pacifist route was not enough. This could be the tragedy unfolding and the revelation of what we need to really do to save everyone. Again, this is very much up for interpretation of what the revelation could in fact be. And this leads directly into finally changes. The player sees what needs to happen and what they need to change once the tragedy happens, and are presented with a Chapter 0 reset and to take action to change the world for the better. Or this could possibly lead to the fallen hero's journey where the player either grows resentful or they just want to see what happens, much like an Undertale leading to save bleed, etc. And again, this leads to return changed, where this has to be just Chapter 0. If Deltarune is a hero's journey, then the returned, changed part of Deltarune would have to be a Chapter 0 event that lets you restart with all the previous knowledge of the previous runs with a more open-ended gameplay effect. Alright, now let's talk about the eggs. Chapter 3 eggs specifically. I think the Chapter 3 egg is very likely to be another meta-narrative trap. Did you find it on your own, or did you look it up in a guide? And if you did, what does Toby think of the player who just wants to see what happens? At what point does curiosity cross into detachment? When does playing a game turn into following a guide to make sure you didn't miss anything? Sometimes the fear of missing out can really lead to poor choices. Now, does this mean all the eggs are bad? I doubt it. Does it mean that Chapter 3's egg may be a direct link to Friend or Gaster? Plausible, but mostly speculation. One thing that's notable is that everything seems to happen in almost Chris's mind space in some way. So all the eggs seem to be about Chris. Now, that leaves me with 3 possible paths that the eggs might take. Road 1, where the egg is useful, but only to Chris. Collecting the egg says some kind of hidden utility. Chris gains something, perhaps an insight on themselves or growth as a character. Perhaps this is another step. This could be a step in them overcoming their trauma. This could be, in fact, somehow unlocking a memory of them and how they started working with the Knight, or this is yet another speculation iceberg. The second possible road this goes down is that it's all just a joke. All the searching, all the obsessing, just for a possible meta gag in the credits, maybe mocking the player, calling out the fact that you probably looked it up. This is probably the lightest punishment, but still makes you the butt of the joke. Path 3 could be that the egg is harmful, that it incorporates some sort of save bleed and possibly lead up to Friend or Gaster. Now, Toby has expressed a dislike for trophies and achievements, stating that he doesn't want it to influence how players experience his games. But it's worth noting that the eggs are required not to be found in those achievements. Is this the inverse of what Toby wants then? Speculation is still really high, but the core point here is I doubt we want to find Chapter 3's egg. It drifts far too hard into reading a guide to play the game. It just feels wrong to the story when the player is a character in said story. And with that, I think I've covered everything properly. Again, these have all been thoughts that have just been brewing in my head, and I didn't really see anyone talking about them. So even if I end up wrong, that's okay. It's not about being right or wrong. It's hope that drives me to make the choices that I made in the game. and I wanted to share why I made those choices. It's my hope that we're not locked down by the fear of what we might be judged for what we do in the game. It's the hope that I can make right what I did wrong. Again, is redemption possible for the player who just wanted a happy ending for everyone? But I hope that you will show me mercy for my actions, because I wonder what the characters in the game will think of me when all is said and done. But yeah, I hope you found this interesting and it got you to think of new theories, and got you thinking outside the box. Let me know if you think I missed anything, because it's very likely that I did. Or if you want me to go into a deeper dive on any of these subjects. I don't really know how to end these videos still. Oh wait, I forgot to apologize to Rousai.